Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Indirect Costs, How New Government Grant Reforms Can Benefit Your Organization. I'm Todd with the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. We are the state association for nonprofits in Nebraska and western Iowa, and we do that in a number of ways through training and resources on nonprofit management. We also try to serve as the collective voice for nonprofits in the state, and by monitoring public policy issues that affect the sector, and this is one of those great issues that that we want to address. And so we've invited Beth Bowsky and David Thompson from the National Council of Nonprofits to illuminate the new OMB Uniform Guidance, which addresses some new reforms for organizations that partner with government and receive some federal funding through that. They're going to tell us a little bit about how it works, or quite a bit about how it works and how it came to be. The National Council of Nonprofits was instrumental in this reform, and so we've got two fantastic experts here to help us understand the new reform. So these are our two experts today, and Beth Bowsky, Policy Specialist for Government and Nonprofit Contracting, and David Thompson, Vice President of Public Policy. Welcome, Beth and David, and thank you so much for being here. With that, I'll hand it over to you and take it away.
Thanks, Todd. Hello, everybody. I'm David Thompson, National Council of Nonprofits, talking to you from Washington, D.C. My colleague Beth Bowsky is a little closer to you in Cincinnati, Ohio. My focus is public policy and dealing with governments and so forth. But let me tell you a little bit more about Beth. Her experiences as a frontline nonprofit manager, a real person doing real stuff is how I generally refer to it. She is a battle-scarred manager of grants at the federal, state, and local levels. And she did a stint in a government agency in Ohio trying to fix the problems that governments were causing for their nonprofit partners. So she's on our side, and she has a world of expertise that we benefit from. I want to show you use this one map to show you who we are, and when I say we, I mean you too. A bit about our network. You as members of the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands are at the center, literally, of this national network of nonprofits. Yours is this right here. As a member of NAM, you're a member of the National Council of Nonprofits and this network. And yours is the largest network of nonprofits in the country, 25,000. And the progress that we have achieved, Todd mentioned that the National Council of Nonprofits did this. It's not true. The network that accomplished the good stuff that we're talking about here. And we did it through interaction of this network of nonprofits talking to each other and the ability of all of us to share information and learn from each other across the country, so that you see those logos there as a representation of ways of communicating across the country quickly. And I want to point out that each of our organizations is small. Not a huge staff at NAM, not a huge staff at the National Council of Nonprofits, but we've had some mighty impact because of this collective work we've been doing. So I want to thank you from the very outset, all of you who have paid attention to the work materials that NAM has put out, responded to surveys that NAM has shared with you, has been able to compile a very great body of knowledge, body of expertise. To the extent we are expert, it's because we've learned from you folks. So thank you. I want you to remember this map. I'm not going to keep coming back and forth to it. Remember the map. If I ever say we, that's the map. That's the definition of the word we that I'm talking about. How to stay in touch with the National Council of Nonprofits very quickly. You can always reach us through Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. You can reach us on Twitter on those two handles, and by signing up for the two newsletters we do, National Nonprofit Advocacy Matters, which I believe you get directly from us, as well as a monthly Nonprofit Knowledge Matters. On the screen there is where you go to subscribe to those, and yes, you will receive these slides at the end of the presentation. Quickly again, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the big deal. We're going to tell you up front why this matters rather than bury it at the back. We're going to talk briefly about how we got here, which is a good story to tell. Beth's going to cover the key changes, the substantive changes in the uniform guidance, how you can prepare for implementation, and then I'll come back with things we all can be doing together to ensure that all the good stuff we're talking about actually goes into effect. Now, rather than save the groundbreaking news for the end, we want to talk about it up front. So the big deal, or what is the big deal? Todd, I know why we think it's a big deal. Why did you think that folks in Nebraska and Iowa ought to hear about it? Why is this a big deal, big enough deal that you invited these people to spend time with us today?
We think this is a really important conversation and an important initiative because nonprofits do a lot to partner with government to provide services and programs to the public. And we know that we've heard through our membership that it isn't always an easy task. It can be difficult to be reimbursed for services provided. The auditing requirements can be complicated, and so despite everyone's best intentions, it hasn't always been the greatest partnership. And so I know that through the OMB Uniform Guidance that a lot of these issues are being addressed, and it's also important because it's part of this larger conversation that NAM is a part of, which looks at what the true cost is of operating a successful nonprofit organization. And we want to bring light to that, and we think that this OMB Uniform Guidance is one of those big first and very high profile steps in that direction.
Thanks. These new rules that we're talking about here have been called a seismic shift in the way government does business with nonprofits, and it's a real game changer. What we're talking about from our perspective here at the National Council of Nonprofits and across that network I showed you, the biggest point is that the federal mandate on payment of indirect costs. The title of our presentation today is all about that. When government, very simply, hopefully simply stated, when federal money is involved, your nonprofit must be paid some or all of your indirect costs. Now, for the big picture, this spells respect from the federal government for what you do. The feds are saying indirect costs are real, they are necessary, and must be paid for by somebody. And they're saying that governments that receive money from the federal government to pay you has to pay the indirect cost. That fits in perfectly with what Todd just said about understanding real costs, understanding the full costs of providing services. The federal government is saying indirect costs, sometimes people use the word overhead, are real and are necessary. Now, I was looking at data right before we got started, data that was published last year by the Urban Institute here in D.C. about Nebraska and Iowa. And it showed that in both of your states, 1 out of 5 nonprofits that have indirect costs arbitrarily capped by governments report being paid zero. No indirect costs. We don't, the message, we don't pay for that. Zero. 80 to 87%, depending on the state, of those that are capped report getting 10% or less. So this is a significant problem for many of the government contractors, many with government grants across your states. So the changes that the OMB Uniform Guidance is implementing can have a real, very clear and present impact in what you're doing. I'm going to hit briefly on some caveats in the event you go running down the streets yelling at the good news. But before you do, let me point out that the mandate to pay indirect costs flows from the federal government all the way through to nonprofits, no matter how many governments the money goes through, how many nonprofits the money goes through. You on the front lines receiving payment for your services based on it comes from money from a federal grant have to be paid your indirect costs. And when it's passing through entities, those are called pass-through entities, and they all have to respect your rights to indirect costs. This applies to local and state governments too. The invitation, the description of the program went out of its way to make that clear, but this is something we're finding people aren't recognizing, that even though they're federal grants reforms, they apply to money you get from states and locals because usually it's passed through. There may be caps on payments of indirect costs in federal statute. If so, if there's a federal statutory cap on payment of indirect costs, then the mandate doesn't apply. Otherwise, it does. It's complicated. We all need to do some research, and we can help you do that. But payment of indirect costs is not subject to the whims of a program officer like we've seen across the country. It's not subject to a statement we heard from Los Angeles that something was funded through federal money and a bond statement. A program officer in Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles, said the voters didn't vote to pay you indirect costs. Yes, they did. The voters didn't think about that. It's people make up stuff on indirect costs. We know they're real. Federal government knows they're real, and now the dynamic is changing on this. How do you know whether federal money is involved? I'm going to save that for Beth because that's part of her presentation. But you will. The rules are changing on that. I'm going to cut short my next couple of slides just to give you more time to get the details from Beth. We refer to this as a happy advocacy story or an advocacy saga with a happy middle, because the federal government, because the rules we're talking about, remember that map I showed you, the rules we're talking about would not have come about without the combined work of the network that I've been referring to. Recession hit in 2008. This network rallied behind the nonprofits, their nonprofit members who were struggling. We did a great deal of research identifying the problems, the abuses, what was happening across the country. Thinking that late payment was the biggest problem, we discovered there are many, many other problems that nonprofits were having. And we proposed solutions. Those are some of the documents we put out. Relevant to the story of the OMB Uniform Guidance, since 2011, 2010, 2011 through 2013, federal government was ordered by the president to streamline, reduce burden, go through all the complicated rules, the 8 different circulars from the Office of Management and Budget, streamline them, try to make sense out of this stuff and make it easier for everybody. When they did it, you see it on the screen, that they left nonprofits out. The main focus was making it easier for governments and higher education. They forgot about nonprofits. Our community came together, advocated like crazy through conference calls, webinars, those surveys that many of you have filled out. Again, thank you. Giving input, giving real-world experiences. The Government Accountability Office weighed in as well. State associations, national nonprofits, a whole bunch of folks weighed in. Big point, the big success story is the Office of Management and Budget listened, put out the Uniform Guidance, a draft, at the end of 2013, and they went into effect at the end of 2014. They're now in effect. It's been a great deal of advocacy work across the way. The rules that came out at the end of 2013 were confusing, needed clarification, and the Office of Management and Budget has made changes. They've made technical corrections. They've issued frequently asked questions. The reason I tell you all this is that this is not something that nonprofits have passively sat back and taken. We, the nonprofit community, have insisted on these reforms, and we continue to be successful in getting them improved so that the promise of the reforms will actually move toward reality. We're not all the way there yet, but everything I've said is to make the point, this isn't a tax form that you fill out and you send back. We get to change the form. We've had the opportunity to use the federal government as our ally in this occasion to get respect and get reimbursed for the real costs that we've been told in the past we don't get paid. So I'll end there and switch it over to you, Beth. There's your page.
Great, thanks. And just to follow up a little bit on what you were saying, David, too, in terms of why this is referred to as being the middle of the saga. And that is because while all this work has now been done that has established what the rules are, although they're still working on clarifications and technical corrections, so everything's not final. The point of the fact that this is middle is just because these things now exist, they don't happen on their own. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that these changes that we're going to go through actually get implemented. So just kind of wanted to make that point, and now we'll get into the meat of it. The uniform guidance is structured in these three basic categories that you see on the screen. It is, as David said, a bringing together of 8 OMB circulars that were used by nonprofits, by governments, and by universities now, and are actually no longer in circular form, but are in the Code of Federal Regulations instead. But I have put out to the side, for those that know these things and are aware of these things, where kind of the reference to the circular that the section in the new uniform guidance kind of aligns with. So the administrative reforms align with the A110, cost principles A122, and the audit stuff, the A133. We're gonna go through, excuse me, each of these broad sections, and I'll highlight some of the key changes. There is one thing that we're not going to cover today, but I do want to mention it, and that is that there is within the guidance a new requirement that nonprofits using federal money to make purchases are going to need to be following the federal rules and regulations on purchasing, or what you may hear referred to as the FAR, you have to follow the FAR rules. I'm not going to go into it because when this came up, the discussions with OMB were, this is brand new and a lot more than you think it is. You just can't drop this bomb on nonprofits and expect that they can do this immediately. And so they agreed to provide a 1-year grace period for that piece to go into effect. So we won't go into it today, but it is something that I thought everybody should be aware of and be thinking about regardless. In terms of what is covered here, the guidance went into effect for nonprofits and states, local governments on December 26, 2014 for awards that are made after that date. So existing awards are not affected. You follow the same rules that you were. It's only new awards that you get after the December 2014 date. In terms of the audits, the clock starts at the beginning of your fiscal year that began after December 26, 2014, meaning that it affects your audit for 2015 that's conducted in 2016, if that's assuming that you need a single audit. If you don't, then it doesn't matter for you. In terms of what's covered, the guidance applies to all nonprofits receiving federal funds, and that means whether you receive them directly from the federal government, or what's actually more likely, you receive them indirectly, either through the state, through local government, and perhaps even another nonprofit. The problem is oftentimes when you get an award from the state or local government or even another nonprofit, you aren't made aware that there's actually federal money in there, and so that's something we'll get to talking about in just a couple of minutes, because that obviously had to be addressed since you need to know. It applies to grants. It applies to cost reimbursement and fixed price contracts and subcontracts. So I don't know, different places call them different things. They may call them POS or purchase of service agreements. They may just call them contracts. They may call them grant contracts. It doesn't really matter what they're being called. The fact is if the money started as federal money, then the guidance is going to apply. I point that out really specifically because one of the things that we have already heard from state governments is, well, we don't have to pay indirect costs on contracts. Yes, you do. So, again, it's a one of the many misunderstandings that are out there that you should be aware of. Don't worry about what they are necessarily called when you get them. It's what did they start out as, and that's what determines whether or not the guidance applies. And as David said, the one caveat is that there are, if there is a cap in federal statute, then the indirect cost piece would follow what that federal statute says. There are also a few funding streams that don't get covered, that are excluded. Any block grants that were created under the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 are exempt from all but the audit requirements. And then there are some of the entitlement funds are exempt from some of the provisions in the Uniform Guidance, but not the requirement to reimburse for indirect costs. So again, the important thing really to remember is it doesn't matter whether you're getting the money directly from the federal government or whether you're getting it from a pass-through, and nor does it matter what it's called when it gets to you. If it's started off as federal money, then the guidance is going to apply, except in those limited situations. We'll go into the pre-award requirements just really briefly, because these actually are not requirements so much of you as the nonprofit. These are requirements of the government or the pass-through entity, and I bring them up because it tells you gives you an idea of some things that you can expect from the pass-through entity or the federal government as the funder, if you will, so that you know what they should be doing. One thing is they need to now post the availability of funds for at least 60 days. Now, excuse me, the guidance, it's a little odd. This was a big issue for the government people, understandably, because of budget timings and whatnot. So what the guidance says is that they should be posted for 60 days, but they must be posted for at least 30 days, unless there is an emergency. The governments have been provided with a list of very specific and consistent information that has to be in the RFP. So you should start seeing some standardization of the information that's being required of you. The same with the application requirements. You should start seeing some consistency in that. And with the Data Act, you'll see even more of that happening as we move forward, because there's an attempt to make sure that everybody is asking for the information in the same way, so that the government can aggregate it and use it, but also it'll save, as a nonprofit, you're not having to redo every report because somebody is using different parameters in how they want the information provided to them. And then the other thing is that there is to be a merit process for selecting what applications get funded. Some agencies already do this, but now it's going to be required. And in the RFP, you will have to be told, here's the criteria that's going to be used to determine who gets funding from these applications. So they are to be based on, who does it look like can really do the best job and have the best outcomes and whatnot, not who's the cheapest necessarily. For post-awards, there's a new threshold for needing to get a single audit. Previously, that you may have heard that referred to as an A133 audit. But again, since there is no more A133 circular, it is now referred to as a single audit. And the threshold for needing that is increased from $500,000 up to $750,000. So OMB has estimated that means that about 5,000 fewer nonprofits will actually have to undergo a single audit, although still 99.9% or some amazing amount of the federal dollars will still be audited through a single audit. As a subawardee, the government is, again, going to have to provide you with some very specific information, and this is what we've been referencing. They must tell you where the funds they're using are coming from. So there is no question, do you have federal money mixed in with this state grant or not? And it's really important you know that. One, because you need to know whether that money needs to be counted toward reaching the threshold for the single audit. But it also tells you whether or not you can expect that you should be reimbursed for the indirect cost piece as well. Pass-throughs are going to have to now conduct risk assessments of subrecipients, so and verify audit compliance. The idea behind this is not to eliminate or reduce the number of nonprofits who may be eligible to get government funding. The idea is actually the opposite. It's to increase the eligibility of nonprofits, so that if you're a new, say a nonprofit that's never gotten government funding before and you're doing this for the first time, you may not have all the infrastructure things that you need in place to really manage that grant thoroughly or properly or the way the government says that you need to. So in that case, they would identify you as being high risk. That wouldn't mean you wouldn't get the funding. What it would mean would be they may put some additional criteria on you to ensure that things go well. It may be that you have to go through a special training on how to manage government funds, or that you'll have some more frequent reporting requirements, or they may monitor your activities a little more often just to make sure that things are going well. So it is not an exclusionary thing. It's really intended to be an inclusionary thing. If you need to have a single audit, it's going to have to be posted on a federal website in machine-readable format. That's actually part of the Federal Funding and Transparency Act of 2006. Again, it probably isn't something that you'll have to do. Your auditor will probably do that, but it's something you should be aware of. And then, obviously, the thing that everybody is probably the most interested in is that pass-through entities are going to have to pay the indirect cost piece. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's the way it works. If you have an approved federal indirect cost rate, then everybody has to pay that rate. Other federal agencies do, or any pass-through entity. And then if you want, you can also request that that rate be extended for up to 4 years on a one-time basis. If you do not have an approved federal rate, which is most nonprofits, then you can either negotiate a rate based on your actual costs using the federal cost principles, or you can elect to use what's referred to as the de minimis rate, which is 10% of your modified total direct cost. Again, there is the cap on if there's federal statute. A cap in federal statute will override this, but you're not going to find that really all that often. There are a couple of things I do want to point out with regard to this, again, because I'm seeing, I'm getting a lot of reports from nonprofits across the country about misinterpretations and misunderstandings about things. So I just want to kind of highlight them here. One is that there is a difference between administrative costs and indirect costs as far as the federal government is concerned. And that's important because frequently if you go look up a federal statute, say for example, to see if there is a cap on a funding stream that you get, quite often there is a cap on the administrative cost. But that is very different from there being a cap on the indirect cost. Administrative costs can be direct or indirect. So, but that for some reason it's being seen. They're being seen as being synonymous when in fact they're not. The other thing that's really important that again I'm seeing frequently is that when we talk about 10% of modified total direct costs, those are modified total direct costs are organizational costs. So it's 10% of your direct costs for your organization, not for the grant or contract. I'm seeing that quite frequently. That it's like, oh, okay, so we get 10%. We'll be giving them 10% more on their grant or contract. No, that is not what 10% of your modified total direct cost is. And it's an important thing because those are probably the two most common mistakes I'm seeing happen when these things when new agreements are being negotiated. In order to determine what your indirect cost rate is, or to even for that matter to determine what 10% of your modified total direct costs are, the first thing you have to do is figure out which costs are direct and which are indirect. And it may sound simple, but it's not always as simple as it sounds. Direct costs are those things that without question relate to a specific program or grant. Everybody knows, if it goes away, can you still do this program? If the answer is no, then it's a direct cost. Indirect costs are expenses that are for your entire organization. And then obviously what happens is then that grant or program would take on a portion of those costs based on the amount of benefit that it receives. So that would be things like the CEO, the accounting staff, HR, IT, legal fees, insurance, things like that. And as simple as that really sounds, it's not always quite so clear. Give you a few examples. If you have a receptionist that answers the phone, makes copies, does filing, it's an indirect cost. But if that receptionist in answering the phone also does intake forms for people that may be in one of your programs, then the time that they spent doing that is a direct cost to the program. Depending on your facilities, if you have one program in one building, it's a direct cost. If you have multiple programs operating out of the same space, then it's probably going to be an indirect cost. And I'm saying probably because there's a lot depends on the situation and how things are set up on whether or not something gets charged as direct or indirect. It's not what is the cost. It really is about how are you tracking it, and is it clearly identifiable to a specific program. So take the example of a copier. If there's a copier in the administrative offices that everybody just goes in and uses as they need, then the costs associated with that are going to be indirect. But if each program area has a counter that they have to plug into the copier when they make copies, and then the finance people or the accounting staff distribute the cost for printing based on how many copies each one of the programs made, then they are direct costs. So there's not a simple, here's a list of what's direct and indirect. You really do have to look at how things are being tracked and whether or not they can be clearly identified with the program. There are a couple of changes in the Uniform Guidance with regard to direct and indirect. One is that program managers are now allowed to be charged as direct costs. They used to be indirect. Now they can be direct. And computing devices under $5,000 can be charged as supplies. They don't need to be capitalized. Whether they're direct or indirect will depend on what they're used for.
Hey, Beth, we have a question.
Yeah. Sure.
Really good question.
Okay.
If the grantee is a governmental entity, like a state organization, do they have to take indirect costs, or can they opt not to?
They can opt not to.
Okay.
I maybe at the government, there may be reason why to do that. I'm not sure what it would be, but there may be.
What we found in various parts. Okay, what we found in various parts of the country is that frequently there will be a General Services Administration that essentially is the indirect cost of governmental agencies across a state or across a community. So it's more complicated than just a yes or no, I think, but still nonprofits and I guess governmental entities can opt not to. All right, back to you.
Yes, thanks. Then we need to, once you know which costs are direct and which are indirect, then you have to determine which costs are allowable or not allowable. And here's where some of the confusion happens with some of the terms, because the term when you're talking about just general, talk about, let's say, private foundation funding, you're typically going to see the terms overhead and or administrative costs used. And when they use them, those are all-inclusive costs in terms of your organizational costs. That's not the same thing, though, with government. The terms are used differently. As I said, the administrative costs can be direct or indirect. If you could think of those more being kind of program administration versus organizational administration, and the indirect cost piece is about the organizational administration, whereas administration, could use a different word here, is about programs. So that's where a lot of confusion happens. But when you're talking about working on government funds, it's important to really understand how somebody is using the terms. Again, the foundations typically don't make the distinction between what's allowable or unallowable. If you think about a nonprofit's 990, for example, and that's frequently where some of the watchdog groups and whatnot use to calculate what your indirect or overhead rate is they pull the numbers directly off your 990. That includes management in general and fundraising combined. But when you talk about, for the government, unallowable, and let me be clear, unallowable doesn't mean you cannot have the cost. Unallowable means the cost cannot be included for reimbursement by government. So unallowable would be fundraising for government. They don't pay the fundraising costs. They won't pay for lobbying. The public relations, those are all really important things for an organization. And just because they're termed unallowable doesn't mean you can't have them. It just means the government's not going to reimburse you for them. So, it's important to know the distinction there. When you talk about allowable, what's not allowable, the government talks about looking at what is it reasonable and necessary to perform the requirements of the grant or contract. Do you have to do this, and is this a reasonable cost for doing it, or a reasonable way to go about doing it? And so if you're questioning is this cost allowable, those would be kind of the first couple of questions to ask yourself. And if you can say yes, they absolutely are reasonable, and yes, they absolutely are necessary, then chances are it's going to be allowable. But you always have the option of checking with your pass-through entity as well to make sure that that's the case ahead of time, so that you don't get anything disallowed. Let's see. There we go. Okay. I'm going to wrap up here, and so that we have some time for questions. And David also, I'm going to turn things back over to David. But I just really wanted to point out that you can see, and obviously we've just hit the highlights here, that there's a lot that goes into the new guidance. And truthfully, not all of it. In fact, there's a lot of it that really isn't new, even though it's being referred to as the new uniform guidance. A lot of these things have actually been in place for many years. It's just nobody has ever followed them. And I bring that up because I think it's really important to realize that, again, this being the midpoint of the saga, we've gotten rules and regulations in place that benefit both government and nonprofits. But unless we really work to make sure that they're implemented, they aren't going to be. And change is always difficult. It always takes more time than you think. But it's going to be up to us to make sure that us being the whole map, that those things happen. So David, I'm going to turn back over to you.
Thank you.
At this point.
So back to now what do we do? The promise is what Beth has just described. The reality is what we're seeing is sketchy or is varied all over the country. Recap of what we know: the money flows from the feds through states and local governments and many different entities and so forth to nonprofits, and the mandate on indirect costs does apply all the way through that. We know that waivers and intimidation are not allowed. We had this experience in New York several years ago where New York has the best statute mandating, requiring that nonprofit contracts be done on time, that you're not working before the contract starts and so forth. A recent report says the finding said that the state officials violate the statute 77% of the time. So good words on paper don't matter if they're not being followed. What we found in New York was that the government officers would require nonprofits to sign waivers of their right to late contracting interest before they were handed the contract. So that is not allowed. And the reason we know, the reason I bring this up and the reason we know about it is New Yorkers usually aren't shy and usually don't sit quietly and take it. They speak up. And because nonprofits spoke up in New York, we all collectively knew the stories, and Office of Management and Budget said, no, we don't want that to happen. So they wrote specific responses to questions on that point in the frequently asked questions, and we were able to point to black letter law so that as people are interpreting the new rules, as questions come up, we'll be able to point to that. And as more questions come up, we'll be able to do even more. There's still some other questions that exist. Beth talked about the difference between contracts and grants. We consistently hear stories or hear from nonprofits on the front lines and some government folks saying, gee, is this a contract or a grant, and doesn't matter. The answer is usually it doesn't matter, whatever label they put on it, these rules apply. Question about triggering negotiations over indirect costs. Beth mentioned that if you don't have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, you can choose either to take the 10% de minimis rate or negotiate your own rate. We're finding that some pass-through entities aren't eager to go into negotiations and things like that. So we're working to build up some better mechanisms in place. A big problem we have with all of this, and again, that picture that said the happy middle, as we're in the middle stages, is that the enforcement of these rules hasn't been built in as effectively yet as we want. We know that government audits will have to take place after the fact. So there could be adverse audit findings. Beth and I were talking with the Association of State Auditors yesterday. And yes, they frequently do the state audits, and they do the adverse findings, and the feds can follow up with reclaiming monies from the state. So there could be ramifications down the road, but not necessarily while the nonprofit is still in business. So we're working to build some quicker responses and solutions. There may be a contracting review process in Nebraska or Iowa. I don't know. We would love to find out. Most importantly, when problems do come up, we know that direct communications with government officials is needed. Hey, the contract says this, or you're telling me that we're only going to be paid 5%. We believe we're entitled to 10% or more. Let's work through it. Speaking up. The network's developed a document, Know Your Rights and How to Protect Them. That's a picture of it on the screen, and you can see the blueprint there. The point of that paper is a short version of what Beth and I are talking about, and then some kind of black letter law, the rules of the road and how they are developing, what we've learned. That you'll be given a link to that document when we're done. We're looking for other opportunities and other ideas. But on direct communications, we know that many nonprofits don't want to tell their funder that the funder is breaking the law or the funder is not following the rules correctly. We, the National Council, generally don't tell our foundation supporters negative stuff about them. And frequently nonprofits that do have grants and perform work on behalf of governments don't want to, you call it, bite the hand that feeds you or go against your funder. We believe that the new rules give you the opportunity, give you leverage, give you rights that deserve to be enforced. You can do them individually, and you can do them working through the the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. We're working with Todd and Ann and the whole gang there to build capacity through trainings, through this network, so that if you ask them a question, your user are going to know, but if not, they can ask Beth, or they can ask others within the network. So you're not alone, and the NAM can serve as a filter for you to get good, solid answers without concerns that there will be negative ramifications. We are all in it together, and we're all on the same side. We've developed a variety of tools that we're moving forward to help you enforce, help you promote, protect your rights, and build your sustainability. Best ways of taking advantage of this is to engage, as I said, with the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. If you read the Uniform Guidance and you haven't gotten a straight answer from Beth or me yet, ask them. Tell them what's not clear, that we can get a clarification. Either we can answer, or the language itself is not clear, we hadn't noticed it, and we can go to get some answers. Also, we ask that you share with NAM what you're hearing. If you have if you get an RFP that doesn't look right, if you get or you hear great stories of government officials doing things, going out of their way, doing the extra mile, we absolutely want good stories too, because let's face it, if something's being done right, we certainly want it to be replicated elsewhere in the country. And we have a nonprofit guidance implementation report form. I'm encouraging you to contact NAM on all these things. You can also fill out a form that's online. You'll get the link to that when the call is over. But also, we have ways of fixing it. Beth runs a national task force on government nonprofit contracting reform. That task force has officials from high-ranking officials from various state governments and nonprofits and professionals across the country. We tasked them with identifying challenges in the Uniform Guidance, and they responded. They asked questions, and the Office of Management and Budget wrote answers to those questions that strengthened knowledge across the country. Beth and I also serve on an ad hoc advisory committee to OMB and the collection of federal agencies that wrote the Uniform Guidance. We have the opportunity about quarterly to raise issues in a group setting so that Native American tribes are there, and higher education is there, and state governments and so forth, so that we can talk about them broadly and sharing concerns, sharing ideas. And that's been very effective in getting things done and spreading the words and things like that. But we're looking for your input. As you discover things are being done right, let us know. Things are being done wrong, let us know. Or it just doesn't make sense to you, let us know, because if we're not putting stuff out that's clear, then we're not making progress. I see that there's at least one more question, and
yes, there is.
Why don't you ask that, and then maybe we'll open up the lines after we respond to that.
Okay, terrific. The question is, how do we get a federally approved indirect cost rate?
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, unfortunately, unless you have a grant or contract directly with the federal government, you cannot. That's unfortunately the only way to do it. So if you get one of those, you have that option. I would encourage you to take a look at it and do it, because then everybody has to accept that rate. Now, let me say this, and this is a great opportunity, advocacy opportunity on a statewide basis. Right now, as I mentioned, you have the option of doing the 10% de minimis or negotiating a rate. However, states don't have any real rules or regulations in place around that. So essentially what's going to happen, at least initially, is that you're going to have to negotiate that rate individually with every one of your agreements. Now, you're going to go through, at least internally, the same process as you would to get a federal rate in terms of how do you calculate it. But wouldn't it be great if through advocacy you could get the state to say, you know what, we're going to figure out how to do just one rate as well, and then have everybody in the state use it for each one, I'm not saying one rate that all nonprofits get, but one rate for each nonprofit based on their actual costs, rather than having to negotiate one each time there's an agreement. It's a huge savings of time for the nonprofit as well as for the government if you can get that arranged, and that would be, to me, that's like a really early, almost easy kind of advocacy thing that's beneficial to everybody.
And Beth, is that just a pie-in-the-sky idea of yours?
It's not really. I think that we have actually Illinois is doing work in this area, and actually took it even a step further than I'm suggesting. And what they've said is that Illinois has said not only are we going to have a standard rate for each nonprofit, but we're going to pay that on state funds and federal funds. We're not going to make a distinction. And we're not even going to worry about the 10% de minimis. What we're going to do is we're going to hire an outside company to come in, and for each nonprofit that we have an agreement with, we're going to sit down with them, help them figure out what their actual indirect cost rate is, and then we're just going to pay it.
So it can be done. Here's a great question that we've just gotten in. If you have a government grant, how do you go about applying for the rate? How do you get started? So let's presume that it's a state grant.
Well, you would do that through the negotiation process of for that state agreement. That's what I'm saying, is that it would be really great if the state would then take it a step further and say, let's not have to negotiate a rate each time we do this. Let's figure out what your nonprofit's rate is and just use it.
Right. Another question. Let me go ahead and answer. The 10% is what you can elect, so you don't have to negotiate the 10%. You may discover early on. We are early in the change of the rules, and the federal government has done a pretty poor job of spreading the word and doing trainings. We say this to them directly, and they agree. So early on, there may be pushback from those who've been managing federal grants and state grants forever and ever, that they don't know about the rules. They may give you pushback. But the de minimis, the 10% modified total direct cost rate, is your election. If you've never had a rate, you can elect that, so there's not negotiations there. Anything
right, but you do have to provide the backup, to be able to say, here, this is what our modified total direct costs are, so here's what the 10% of it is.
And that's done as you are during the RFP or the bidding on the film.
No, once if they accept your application for funding, then you would go into that process, or include it in your budget. What'll happen is you put it in your budget, and then as you're finalizing the agreement, there may be some negotiation around that. And typically, at least when you're talking about a federal rate, what the negotiation is, well, is that really an indirect cost, or should it be a direct cost, or is that really allowable or unallowable?
Mm-hmm. And we've received the ultimate question, which is, never had any dealings with the federal government. We don't have a negotiated rate. We only deal with the pass-through entity. Get the 10%, right? The answer is yes. Or
negotiate a rate using the same principles as the federal government uses. But the minimum would be the 10%, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Is it likely that the federal government might pass new requirements on states to assist nonprofits with compliance, like Illinois? I doubt it. And I say that because that's the one thing I think I've noticed anyway in as we try and work through some of these issues with OMB and the COFAR, is that they're very much aware of not wanting to be too dictatorial with the states and allowing them the flexibility and the room to do some of these things the way they should, as long as they're following the uniform guidance. So I doubt there would be federal regulations requiring the states to set these things, like a standard rate up for each nonprofit, but I suppose it could happen. Now, the compliance in general, they are required to to comply. But as David was saying, at this point, most of that would not, until we get some other things in place, it probably wouldn't even be noticed that they're not complying until an audit.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Aaron. This is a brilliant question from a brilliant friend I see I see who that is. What OMB has told us directly is that they don't have that many tools for forcing ahead of time, forcing compliance in advance, and they are relying on this network to let them know how it's working. And that's very unsatisfactory. So that's why we keep talking about this is not just the finance side, this is the advocacy side as well. Unless there's a statute mandating the application of the money to a federal statute applying these rules to all money, including state money, it's not going to happen, and I don't see Congress doing that right away. We had another question, though. What if you've already submitted your budget materials with your grant application? Can you negotiate after the fact?
That's a sticky one. Partially, it depends on if it is an application to the federal government. You probably can, because you've got a 90-day window after you are notified of approval to apply to get the negotiated rate. So you would be pulling in those numbers. If it's the state or local government, it may just be up to the person you're negotiating with whether or not they're going to allow you to do that. There may be. It really depends on how flexible, because of these things being new, they're willing to be. I can't give you a definitive answer, though. Unfortunately, I'm sorry.
And perhaps you could follow up. I think, Kimberly, you've asked the question. Perhaps you could follow up with Beth offline. Let me go to the last question that we see on the screen here, and I'll move to the last slide to alert Todd that we're wrapping up. And I'm going to summarize this last question is, can we have our cake and eat it too if we're dealing with the federal government? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you're working directly under a grant from the federal government, yes, you can claim the 10% rate. No questions. You claim it, the 10% modified total direct cost. And then you can negotiate a higher rate. You can do that on going forward, and then you can negotiate a higher rate if you determine that your costs are higher. Beth, what were you going to say?
Yeah. I just want to be kind of careful here in that, first of all, you can only use the 10% if you've never had a federally approved rate before. But once you decide to negotiate a rate, you can't use that 10% anymore. The other thing is that if you get a federal grant and you decide to negotiate, you need to do that within I think they give you 90 days to at least get the process started. So you can't just 8 months into a grant decide, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and try and get a federal rate now.
Okay. Todd.
David, Beth, thank you so much for your expertise today and taking the time to help us understand the uniform guidance. I want to thank everyone who was able to tune in today. We have recorded the presentation, and so I'll be sending everyone a link probably early next week as we get it loaded on our YouTube station so that you can review some of the material. You saw on the previous slide that Beth and David left some of their contact information, so I assume that they are free to contact you with some questions offline. This is an issue that, great. This is an issue that NAM wants to look into more deeply, especially at the state level, and so we look forward to your support in our membership as we explore more deeply government and nonprofit contracting. David and Beth, thank you again.
Our pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Our pleasure, yes, absolutely. And please do not hesitate if you have questions, concerns, don't understand, contact us and let us know. We can help you out.
Okay. Bye all.
Great. Bye all. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.